Hi, I'm Shama Sawant, a member of Socialist Alternative in the United States.
Jag heter Livia från Rättvisepartiet Socialisme i Sverige.
I'm a member of Socialist Alternative in England, Wales and Scotland.
Soy Mauro de Alternativa Socialista en México.
I'm Socialisme.be from Workers and Socialist Party.
Ich bin Janine von der Sozialistischen Alternative.
I'm a member of the Socialist Party in Ireland.
I'm Natasha from Greece.
Olá, eu sou Jane Barros, sou militante da LSR, Liberdade, Socialismo e Revolução.
We, as members of the working class and as socialists in America, are fighting against Trump's right-wing regime.
Fighting sectarian division and building working class unity, our members are organised north and south and recently played a big role in the victorious workers' occupation of the Harland and Wolff shipyard.
Estamos trabajando para construir una alternativa socialista para los trabajadores y para la juventud.
Στο ξεκίνημα παλεύουμε ενάντια στις επιθέσεις της κυβέρνησης στα εργατικά και στα δημοκρατικά δικαιώματα.
E faço parte da luta com milhares de brasileiros e brasileiras que estão na linha de frente para lutar contra o governo Bolsonaro.
We are currently campaigning to have, self-organizing a gender strike on issues of national minimum wage, unemployment.
We're currently campaigning and protesting against the hated Boris Johnson Tory government.
Vi jobbar också för att tillsammans med unga formulera revolutionära socialistiska svar på utmaningarna som klimatkampen.
As many of you might already know, we just won a historic re-election campaign in Seattle, fighting against the richest man in the world, Jeff Bezos, Amazon Corporation, and Seattle's big business.
We're International Socialist Alternative, fighting capitalism and for socialism in over 30 countries around the world.
Welcome back to the International Socialist Alternative live Marxist panel discussion, where today we're going to be asking the question, are we in a new Great Depression? My name is Toya. I'm from the United States, and I'm a member of the International Socialist Alternative here, where we're called Socialist Alternative. I want to take a few seconds and ask everyone who's watching today to post the link of this stream to your social media. Let's let all of our friends and family and our neighbors know what it is that we're doing right now. You could even host a watch party. Maybe you can introduce these topics to someone who may not have thought about them before. Let's try to get out there and spread the message. I want to introduce our participants today. They are all members of the International Socialist Alternative from 3 different countries. First, we have Eric in Belgium. Next, we have Claire in England. Hi, Claire. And we also have Paroka in Sweden. So great to see all of you. So it's really important that we have these types of discussions as we continue to go throughout this pandemic. We see more and more of how capitalism as an economic system is completely incapable of dealing with a crisis. I mean, even here in the US, we've reached a point where we have the highest number of deaths in the world from COVID-19 and have no more room in our intensive care units and hospitals. And we don't even have enough space in morgues to deal with the amount of people that are dying. And it's not just a health crisis. We have a crisis on every level: social crisis, economic crisis, political crisis. We're seeing governments throughout the world incapable of being able to provide basic needs for their workers. This is not just a question of availability of resources, but rather a question of distribution of resources. We're having a discussion today because it's crucial to understand the economic impact of this crisis, and it's crucial to prepare the working class for worldwide struggles. This is especially key for Marxists, and the International Socialist Alternative takes this extremely seriously. And that is why during this time, we're continuing to organize in whatever ways we can. And we're hosting discussions like this throughout the world to spread the ideas, to spread our analysis at a time when people are isolated in their homes, alone and frustrated. This week, we're going to be doing things a little bit differently. We're going to be taking questions, video questions from around the world, and our speakers will take turns answering them. And if you agree with the analysis of our speakers and you want to get involved in the socialist movement to fight capitalism, please join the International Socialist Alternative. And also don't forget to like and subscribe to our videos so you can stay up to date. Now let's get started. First, we have a question from Grayson in Philadelphia.
Hi, I'm Grayson from Philadelphia in the United States. So over the past few weeks, we've seen the world take a huge economic nosedive as the virus and the subsequent social distancing has limited market activity. There's record unemployment here in the US as mass amounts of workers have been laid off, but their jobs still exist. So is it possible then that the economic crisis will subside as soon as the virus does and everyone is allowed to go back to work? Thank you.
Thanks so much for your question, Grayson. Eric, why don't you take a stab at this one?
Yeah, thank you, Toya, and thank you also, Grayson, for the question. Before I go into the economic aspects, I would like to stress the brutality, the devastating health crisis immediately impacting on the lives of so many human beings, especially working class families and poor, from whom the question of a bounce back of the economy in too many tragic cases, unfortunately, has lost relevance. On the question of cause and consequence, this coronavirus is a fabrication of the incapacity of capitalism to organize production in a socially and environmentally harmonious way. Capitalism is a system that brushes aside environmental, social, safety, and security considerations for profit. Corona would not have turned into such a pandemic if the outdated capitalist system hadn't restarted shrinking profit by slashing health systems, breaking up stocks, and neglecting warnings which it considers unprofitable liabilities. Now, this speedy developing deep economic crisis will forever bear the name COVID-19. For the ruling classes, the virus will be the villain, the unpredictable natural disaster. In reality, all the combustible material for a new recession has piled up ever since the Great Depression of 2008-9. Back then, the tipping point was the collapse of Lehman Brothers. This trigger could only come to such a maturity because it was resting on non-performing loans. Coronavirus is the Lehman Brothers trigger for the developing crisis. It could only reach such maturity because of the proliferation of all weaknesses that had led to the Great Recession. Since then, world growth has consistently been 2 to 3% lower than before 2008. Productivity levels kept falling. Deflated bubbles were replaced by other, even bigger bubbles, and even though interest rates were lowered and tons of money printed, productive investment never took up. Wages were kept low, housing prices high, and tuition fees, health costs, etc., kept rising. What little benefits recovery has brought went overwhelmingly to the capitalist elite. And the vast sums of money pumped into the financial sector of key capitalist countries overwhelmingly went back into speculation rather than productive investment. In essence, the policy of the key capitalist countries consisted in kicking the can further down the road by pouring in more and more money. And as a result, worldwide debt reached an all-time high, $253,000 billion, or 322% of world GDP. And as such, that could trigger a new, even bigger financial crisis. The scramble for profits increased tensions within and between trade blocs, resulting in protective measures, growing political nationalism, and the partial reversal of globalization. This was the combustible material. Coronavirus and the resulting lockdowns were important triggers, but without the pandemic, other triggers would have activated also the developing crisis.
Thank you so much, Eric. Claire, what do you think about that question?
Well, I agree very much with the important points that Eric has made. And I think that one of the things that coronavirus has done is exposed and brought to the surface all of the pre-existing contradictions, weaknesses, and frankly, the rottenness, which was already there before the outbreak of this pandemic. COVID-19 has starkly revealed the backwards priorities of a system in which the drive for profit is the primary motive force. And I think it's also shown the inability of that system to cope with shocks, especially given the massive underlying contradictions that Eric has touched on. And that's pertinent to this debate, which has been going on, particularly amongst economists within the capitalist press, about what the character of this COVID-19 recession is likely to be. So early on, there were some who argued that what we would be likely to see would be a short, sharp drop, only to be followed by a rapid and sustained bounce back once things began to return to normal, the lockdowns ended, and so on. But I think that that optimistic notion of a so-called V-shaped recession is now dismissed by most of the serious capitalist commentators. They understand that this is a far, far more serious crisis for their system than that. That's because the fundamental ill health, which had already existed in the world economy, as Eric described, has not gone away. In fact, what has instead happened has been that many of the processes that already existed, those growing trends towards so-called deglobalization, for example, have actually been accelerated by the coronavirus crisis. This is a crisis like no other. These are not my words, but actually those of Kristina Georgieva, the head of the IMF. And if you look at the figures about the catastrophic impacts of the last few months on the global economy, they're pretty staggering. Especially important are those which relate to the massive job losses that have ensued in the last months. More than 6.6 million in the US are said to have lost their jobs, an incredible number. In the UK, some estimates are that 5% of all workers have been laid off already, representing tremendous hardship for millions of families. And it's now estimated that up to 3 million families face going hungry and will have to rely on charity for food handouts in the immediate future here in the UK. So forecasts for the next quarter are predicting double-digit declines in the world's economic output in the second quarter, with the early optimism about a V-shaped recession now essentially off the agenda. And actually the optimists are now the proponents of a so-called U-shaped model for this recession. But actually the discussion has moved on even from that. And to quote the American economist Nouriel Roubini, the contraction that is now underway looks neither to be V nor U nor L-shaped. Rather, it looks like an I, a vertical line representing financial markets and the real economy plummeting. And I think it's therefore no wonder that when comparing this crisis to previous ones, the comparisons have now changed. The COVID crisis is now increasingly thought to be likely to be similar in its devastation to the Great Depression of the 1930s. In other words, a deep and a prolonged slump.
Thank you so much, Claire. And in case people are just tuning in now, I want to remind everyone what the question was. It was, if the global recession is caused by the virus, won't the economy just bounce back after it subsides? And if you're watching, say your thoughts in the comments. We're interested to see what others think. Paroka, what do you think about Grayson's question?
Oh, hi, everybody. Well, I, of course, agree with Eric and Claire. There won't be a rapid bounce back in the economy. I mean, the first thing is that we don't know how long the lockdowns will last. There are 2.8 billion workers in lockdown now. And this has never happened before. The virus is unique. It's a new virus. It's not investigated yet. I mean, Donald Trump tried to deny it. He and capitalists, they want to put profit before health, but they have to retreat because they don't know how the effects of the virus will be. The social depression following the economic depression is only in the beginning. And they might do desperate moves to reopen the economy, but then the virus can come back. And that's why, I mean, we don't know how long it's going to last. And when it bounces back, shaken capitalists will start production on a lower level. China said that the crisis is over, and of course we have a lot to be suspicious about any statistics from China. But Chinese export decreased 20% in January and February, and it's still decreasing. The export orders are contracting. And the drop in imports is even bigger, and China is a big factor in world economy. To underline this, the magazine The Economist, that sell 1 million copies around the world every week, mainly to capitalists, they have a corporate survival guide, and they say that the exit path from lockdowns will be precarious. There will be uneasy consumers. There will be new health protocols. And they say there will be a wave of mergers and takeovers from all the bankruptcies. Secondly, as has already been mentioned, nationalism is on increase, and it's increased rapidly during the crisis. We knew we had Trump, Bolsonaro. We knew that we had Viktor Orban. They're nationalists, but they're part of an international trend. But now it's got even worse. In Europe now, most countries are saying Denmark first, Norway first, Sweden first. The border between Denmark and Sweden is closed. It's not happened for 50 years or so. One key contradiction behind the regular crisis of capitalism is that capitalists and big business are national, but the markets, the resources, and the production increasingly is international. And that means that there is a huge contradiction. In the 1930s depression, the protectionist measures taken by country after country, with the US in the lead, deepened the crisis. They said, we're going to save the nation, but they did not solve the economic crisis. Production only recovered when arms industry started, and then the real boom did not come after the World War II had destroyed so much of society. After World War II, capitalism tried to establish rules, and that was based on the US economy, US imperialism being the dominant power. And in Europe, later on, a few decades later, the European Union was formed by big business, by banks, by capitalists in different countries, trying to be stronger in competition and to attack workers and public sector. And they therefore formed this union. World trade in this period was a key factor behind growth, showing growth. And that's also been in the recent decades. But now world trade is collapsing. Today's nationalism by almost all government is partly a way to increase their support. They want to get support from their domestic opinion. But it's also their conclusion is that capitalism can't cooperate internationally. There is no global solution. And this will deepen and prolong the crisis. It will hit the weaker economies most, and it will hit those now we've seen with the oil price down falling, commodity pricing falling. It will raise inequality and poverty to new terrible levels. Thirdly, there is this question of decoupling. The fact that the competition between US and China is leading to two parallel technologies and economies and finance and everything. So US imperialism under Trump stepped up the actions against China. And China, the dictatorship in Beijing was surprised. They thought that, well, US companies would not accept this. But instead, they've been lining up behind Trump. And now there is relocation of production from China. It was already on its way. But now, for example, Japan is paying Japanese companies to leave China and go back to Japan. And this will complicate the world economy enormously. Decoupling means parallel systems. And when they say technology, they mainly mean, of course, the military technology. And that's why the US is considering to start its own business competing with Huawei. And this makes the crisis partly more unpredictable than before. Even if they make temporary deals, there is no going back. There are inter-imperialist tensions between China and US, between US and the European Union, in the Middle East, and we see it within the European Union, and in Africa and in Latin America. That means that the bounce back they hope for is not likely to take place in the way the most optimistic think.
Thank you so much, Paroka. One of the comments we had from Paul in Ireland, who says the working class won't stand for the same level of austerity and attacks as last time, I think is super important to consider. And that's actually a great transition into our next question from Rens in Belgium.
Hello guys, my name is Rens. I'm from the Socialisme.be in Belgium, and I had a question for the panel about the economic crisis that is starting to develop. A lot of comparisons are being made with the economic crisis that started in 2008 and had a huge impact on the working class. It was a decade full of harsh budget cuts to public services and falling living standards amongst many workers and youth. Many say that this time it will be even worse. One of the main points that economists had been raising in the past is that the fundamental problem with the economy was a so-called lack of demand, that people were not buying enough because of low wages and huge inequality amongst other things. Now, however, the enormous lockdown measures are disrupting global supply chains and stopping production in some places. This causes a shortage of products. I was hoping the speakers could expand on this. How does this economic crisis compare to the one of 2008? And is it a problem of supply rather than demand?
Thank you for your question. Claire, let's go to you first this time.
Well, there are, of course, lots of unique features to this crisis. Clearly, it has an all-encompassing nature as both a crisis of supply and of demand. Supply is being hit because factories and other large workplaces are being forced to close. Demand is hit because consumer spending is restricted by lockdowns, as well as by the direct effects of job losses, of wage cuts, and so on. But I think it's important to remember that the basis for this crisis is not the inherent biological properties of the coronavirus itself. In fact, this is an economic crisis which is ultimately based on the same fundamental problems as that of 2008, contradictions that were never resolved in the wake of that crash and which have now re-emerged with an even greater force. We've had just over a decade of so-called economic recovery in the wake of that crash. But what has that been based on? In reality, many of the same things that preceded the crisis, namely the unprecedented availability of cheap money based on historically low interest rates, on quantitative easing, and so on. And while this has had the effect of causing a major boom in asset prices, what we see is a continuation of weak investment and of historically low growth in productivity, something which is especially true in a country like Britain. And these underlying issues that weren't resolved have led to the blowing up of new bubbles and of new problems of indebtedness. And all of this means that this new crisis is hitting the economy in an already much weaker state. As the Guardian's economics editor, Larry Elliott, put it, so-called Crash Monday panic, which happened at the beginning of last month, marked a moment when a decade of denial finally ended, and traders woke up to the fact that the financial markets had been bobbing along on a giant wave of debt. Of course, raising a comparison with 2008 doesn't mean that this will be a simple repeat. In fact, this is likely to be much longer, much deeper, and much sharper. The global coordination that we saw on behalf of capitalist governments in the wake of the financial crash just over a decade ago will be much more difficult in a world increasingly divided into competing spheres, as Paroka was just talking about. The sizable stimulus packages will have limited effects. And of course, the same question, that of who pays, is going to come to the fore. Working class people are inevitably going to be asked to foot the bill. Indeed, in all kinds of ways, workers are already paying with their jobs, their wages, their very lives. But the question will be, can the capitalists afford to repeat the same kind of response of widespread austerity, of punishing attacks on the working class that they had in 2008? Because I think increasingly, even the capitalists understand that at stake is the threat of mass upheaval, of revolt, even of revolution.
Thank you so much, Claire. And this is a question that is around a lot because people very much remember what it was like, a little more than 10 years ago. Paroka, what do you think about it?
Well, the short answer to this question is that there will be crisis both of supply and demand. If you first look at demand, another general reason for capitalism going into crisis and slow growth is what capitalist economists call overproduction or overcapacity. It means that they can't sell what they produce and get the profit they wanted. James Buchanan and others call this instead of underconsumption, meaning that workers and poor can't afford even necessities. And on a global scale, this is true, but it's also increasingly happening in richer countries. If I was asked to recommend any reading about the economic crisis in the 1930s, I would say Marxism in Our Time by Leon Trotsky, written in April 1939. He quotes Marx. He said, Marx said, if you have accumulation of wealth on one side, and then at the same time, you will have accumulation of misery, agony, slavery, ignorance, brutality, mental degradation at the opposite pole. And that's the side of the class that produce the wealth of those who have it. And it's a fact under capitalism that workers' wages are less than the product, the value of what they produce. The capitalists buy labor and they receive products that are worth more. And this explained Marx. This is surplus value. This is profit. And that is the driving force of capitalism. They don't mind what they produce surplus value, they produce profit. Workers' wages are therefore not enough to buy what is produced. Over a long time now, several decades in many countries, particularly in the US, wages have not increased. They've rather stagnated and became a lesser part of the economy. That also happened in the 1920s, by the way. And that has been compensated for by credit, by debt. Workers are buying, but on debt and by credit, or by tax reductions. But still, and this has been accepted by the trade union leaders. They should have fought against it, but they have accepted it. Yet consumption stands for a big share of GDP. In the US, it's 68%. In the UK, it's 63%. And even in Brazil, or UK, and in Brazil, it's also 63%. And then more than 1 billion workers will lose their wages, or big parts of them, now in this depression. We don't know for how long. And they won't be offered new credits. They won't be offered tax reductions. On the contrary, the banks will demand back what they have borrowed. And the helicopter money, they call it, the money that the state will give out instead will not compensate. That means that demand will drop. And that, of course, investment will also drop because the companies don't think they can sell what they produce. The Economist, again, this magazine, they say in this downturn, the fall in demand can be 50% in many sectors of society. There will be a slump in consumer confidence, as they call it. And the only engine for consumption for the next 12 to 24 months will be governance. Then you look at supply. It's obvious that part of production has come to a halt. And there will be shortages of key goods. In the global survey at the end of February, 75% of companies said that they already had this disruption in the supply chain, and majority of them had no plan B. On many products, particularly food, there will be sharp increases in prices. Now in Sweden, they say that prices of vegetables and fruit will triple. And that's a prediction, but it's close to happen. And the absurdity and the cynicism of capitalism is exposed. There are factories producing arms, luxury products, they're not closed, while there is this huge shortage of medical equipment. And prices on medicine and medical equipment are rising. Capitalism is showing its real face, something that will have big impact on consciousness. People will understand this is how the system works. For socialists, it shows big possibilities to change production and the economy in a direction that benefits workers, the poor, and the environment, not least. Instead of in a routinist way reopen polluting factories and production of non-essential goods, there should be a democratic overview. Working hours should be cut. Workers' knowledge should be used to transform production, as it happened with General Motors doing ventilators, resulting in a democratic and internationally planned economy. The demand and supply is capitalist words. They should be replaced with production and supply according to need.
Thank you so much, Paroka. Eric, what do you think?
Well, Toya and Rens, of course, for his question and everybody. The 2008 Great Recession followed the Asian, Russian, and Brazilian financial crisis of the late 90s, and then the bursting of the dot-com bubble in 2000. And after that, investors saw in the housing market a safe refuge. With increased demand, house prices went up. Greedy real estate agents attracted less wealthy buyers through so-called subprime mortgages, a kind of modern pyramid scheme. In French, they call it, if I translate it back to English, high-risk mortgage. And in Dutch, where it was translated even later, it's called clutter mortgage. At that time, the capitalists were convinced that by coupling up risky investments and then mix them with more secure ones in collateral debt obligations, that through that, risk could be spread to the extent of just disappearing. They never imagined that risky pieces of investments could intoxicate the more secure ones once the subprime market melted down. It was this, what they called unexpected development, that provoked the collapse of Lehman Brothers and then the Great Recession. Illusions in the ability to extinguish risks, they are gone. The capitalists now rely on the authorities and the central banks to mobilize huge amounts when necessary, with the idea, of course, that in the end, working people will pay the bill. Now, Marxists never had illusions in smart capitalism finding a way to overcome its recurrent crisis. That is because capitalism has a number of inbuilt contradictions. It's socialized production, but appropriation is still individual. Workers are part of a collective chain of production, of division of labor, but with little or no say over what or how is produced, let alone over what happens with the profit. And then on top of that, while division of labor is now internationalized, the capitalist classes rely on national states, which again creates tensions, not only with the working class, but also with the capitalist classes from competing countries. Now, capitalist, as Peroque already explained, squeezes profits from the unpaid labor of workers. That leads to class struggle over wages or profit, but it also creates an inbuilt tendency to overproduction. By far, the main problem for capitalism today is the development of science and technique. Feverish competition requires important research and development to be paid off in ever shorter spaces of time. Now, this undermines profitability in the real production and requires limitations on the free sharing of knowledge through patents. Today, on average, companies pay out 70% of profit in dividends instead of reinvesting in production. Scientific and technical innovations, fortunately, do take place, but they hardly contribute to increased productivity because they are hampered by private ownership. Marx once said that any social system can survive as long as it is capable of developing productive forces, but that otherwise the motor of history, the class struggle, will ignite.
Thank you so much, Eric. And I want to take this opportunity to say hello from everyone all over the world. We have people from Brazil, South Africa, India, Nigeria. And I want to give a special shout out to one of our essential workers on the front line, John, who's a hospital worker in Maryland in the United States, who is listening in from his workplace. Thank you for all the work that you do. And thank you for everyone else who's tuned in. It's crucial that we continue to build movements globally. And as you can see, there are people around the world who are participating in that right now, even at a time when people are quarantined, especially in a time where we're seeing capitalism allow for potentially hundreds of thousands of people to die because of the greed and because of the profit of the billionaires. Maybe you're watching this video right now thinking, I agree, but what can I do? Maybe for some of you, the analysis is new. Maybe it's what you've been thinking about for years. Well, the first step is to join with other workers, other students around the globe that are leading and helping to unite struggles that expose this system for what it truly is. It's inhumane, it's inefficient, and it's cruel. Join the socialist alternative so we can fight against capitalism and fight for a better world, a socialist world. The International Socialist Alternative has members all over. So please check our website for a section closest to you, no matter your continent and no matter your language. Also, please consider donating to keep the work of International Socialist Alternative going through these difficult times. We had a €500 donation from Jonathan in Portland. Thank you so much. Anyone who's watching, can you help match Jonathan's donation by giving €100 or €200? And for those who can't give as much, please consider donating €25 or €50 to help the International Socialist Alternative continue our work. I'm going to go to our next question, which is from Yara in London.
Hi, I'm Yara Khalif. I'm from North London. And in the past few weeks since the coronavirus crisis started, we've seen governments all around the world start to implement measures to combat it. But those measures are the same ones that only a few weeks before they named socialist madness at best. And, you know, in Britain we've had the Corbyn manifesto in the last election that put forward some social democratic points like free broadband for all, for example. And during the election campaign, we saw the Tories and the ruling class really mock those ideas, as saying it will never happen, it's ridiculous. But now they're discussing those ideas exactly in the context of this crisis, especially raising sick pay on a much higher level than it was before for people who are affected by the virus or are furloughed. And I want to know what you thought. Do you think that capitalism is abandoning neoliberalism now, and now we're going to have kind of like a social democratic welfare state, or socialism even? Or do we think that it's a bit more complicated than that? Thank you.
Thanks, Yara. Parulka, let's go to you. What do you think about this changing situation?
I think it is a very good question. I mean, if everything is changing, is not politics changing then? Is there maybe even a left-wing turn in politics? Some seem to fear socialism more than they did before. In Sweden, the youth organizations of the right-wing parties are campaigning and warning, saying that socialism is on its way back. Newspaper editorials are saying that you can't blame privatization. You shouldn't blame the austerity we've done. This is very similar to what happened in the US in the 1930s. Roosevelt's New Deal was being attacked for being socialist. Roosevelt replied that, well, I've taken these measures to save capitalism, to save the capitalist system. And he said, well, I'm representing the interest of the entire capitalist class. Trotsky quoted the defense of Roosevelt from one of the administration's people around Roosevelt, who had said that, well, look here, profits are higher than in the last years of Hoover's presidency, who was before Roosevelt. And Trotsky showed that the achievements of the New Deal were fictitious. They resulted in a huge increase of the national debt. And they prepared for very sharp capitalist confrontation to come after it. And Trotsky said, well, in other words, it's directed into the same channels as the policy of fascism. It's preparing for imperialist confrontation. But there were also socialists who said, well, these measures done by Roosevelt, well, they are semi-socialist, and despite their limitations, and they assisted in creating a myth about the New Deal. And this is a warning against any illusions today in what governments are doing. 40 years after the debate on that, neoliberalism was introduced by the capitalists. It was their revenge against the working class and against welfare states where those existed. With the economic crisis in the mid-70s, the capitalists left the Keynesianism that they used, not classic Keynesianism, but the one that assisted big business in the 50s and the 60s. Neoliberalism is monetarism. It means that finance became dominant. That is banks, central banks, stock markets, and a lot of new financial innovations. Privatization was a word that almost no one had heard about until the 1970s. And that became a big element of neoliberalism. Public sector budget surpluses was also a new innovation. It had not existed. States had borrowed to build welfare state or infrastructure or assist big business. Capitalist globalization accelerated, and it leaped further when capitalism was restored in Soviet Union, in China, and in Eastern Europe. At the same time, the capitalist class, as I explained before, never became international. They were still relying on their national state for support and for a repressive apparatus, and particularly for a military buildup. Now with this crisis, this is an unprecedented crisis, as we've said. They are forced to introduce what was previously thought as impossible or unthinkable. Maybe pay people who are sick. Maybe pay some people who are unemployed. More money for healthcare. They have to nationalize companies. Of course, they did some of this even at the crisis in 2008 and 2009. And then they turned back to austerity and privatizations later. And these policies, neoliberal policies, are still conditions for getting money from the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. And of course, those money are not for free, they are loans. In Sweden, they were planned huge healthcare cuts before this depression. Those cuts have been postponed, but they've not been cancelled. But still, I mean, they are changing something. But any turn from neoliberal globalization into a kind of national policy is not progressive. It's not the beginning of a more humane capitalism. It's something they do to try to save themselves. If you make a parallel, in Europe, socialists are against the capitalist, refugee hunting European Union, the neoliberal European Union. But our alternative is not national capitalism. Our alternative is international European socialism. But if they leave important parts of neoliberalism and start with other policies, it's still a change we should note. It means that something is possible to change. And mass anger from below and struggles might make them hesitant to go back all the way, and they can't because of the contradictions between themselves. And this means that demands for nationalizations and, for example, sick pay is not enough. It has to say that we don't want nationalizations to be given back to private companies or private business later on. We must warn against any illusions in national solutions, in any argument saying we're all in this together. Socialists, trade unionists, climate movements, social movements should mobilize, demand democratic control, demand democratic planning. And they said that nothing could change, and definitely things couldn't change rapidly, but it has done. Now everything is changing, and the working class, socialists, anyone involved in struggle or networks or organization should have to see this as an opportunity to go further and abolishing the entire capitalist system. Thank you.
Thanks, Paroka. Eric, what do you think?
Well, first of all, thanks, Yara, for the very interesting question. It is clear that enormous amounts of money were poured in the system to keep it afloat. Rent rates were kept to zero or even to negative. Money printing presses are running overtime, and the budget discipline is gone in all advanced capitalist countries. Fiscal stimulus is being presented as a relief to households and small business, but just one example. Only 11% of the US $2,200 billion fiscal bill goes to working people's checks. Krugman, the economist, he refers to that bill as a disaster relief. For it to become a stimulus, he says, another $4,000 to $5,000 billion would be required. He warns, by the way, for what he calls a huge fiscal time bomb, when the state and local governments in the US losing tax income and confronted with extra expenses will start sacking workers, teachers, employees, and so on. But there are many potential time bombs. The housing demand in the US is expected to collapse by 35% this year, erasing $1,300 billion of the housing market value. Half of the gigantic worldwide stock of non-financial corporate bonds is close to junk level, threatening a chain of bankruptcies and a financial collapse. With world food in danger, like in 2011, we could see food speculation soar again. OPEC reduced oil production by 10 million barrels, but demand is falling by 35 million barrels a day. The International Labour Organization expects now 1 billion workers worldwide to become either unemployed or see their wages reduced. Another 500 million people will be driven in extreme poverty That's why even the Financial Times now argues for a social contract, like the one after World War II, with a more active role of governments in the economy, public services, less insecure labor markets, and a degree of wealth distribution. Financial Times proposes that to save capitalism, but it won't work. Back then, the war had wiped out property, infrastructure, and capital that had to be rebuilt in competition with another social system. Fordism, which already existed before the war, was applied on a massive scale. The dollar became the reserve currency, and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the precursors of the World Trade Organization, was created. How would that look today? It's impossible. Neo-Keynesians now are arguing what they call modern monetary theory, the production of even more money through the central banks. And they think they are winning the battle now. At this stage, global supply exceeds demand and will, for some time, depress inflation and the interest rate. On top of that, lack of profitability will further stimulate preference for saving over investment. But however, in the very unlikely scenario that modern monetary theory would last, then asset inflation will start spilling over to the real economy, provoking galloping or hyperinflation of an even higher level than that was attained in the 70s. The failure of those dangerous illusions could open the way for more reactionary regimes stoking the flames of nationalist and xenophobic reaction. Reformism and neo-Keynesianism offer no solution to the type of challenges ahead. It's only a bold program of socialist transformation based on the nationalization and democratic planning of the key sectors of the economy, which will, by the way, find a much greater echo today than in the past, that can offer a way out.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much, Eric. Claire, let's go to you.
Well, in Britain, this about turn in policy by the ruling elites towards greater intervention has been made especially stark by the way in which the ruling Conservative Party, who spent a recent general election campaign mocking as extreme Marxist nonsense the policies of the then left leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn. That same party, the Tories, has now been forced to essentially don some of Jeremy Corbyn's clothes, and in some senses to go beyond the policies that Corbyn had himself outlined. And despite having told us for decades that only the markets and the private sector can provide us with high quality goods, with efficiently run public services, these politicians are now being forced to accept that in this time of crisis, the private sector is actually incapable of providing for the needs of the population. Governments worldwide are increasingly being forced by this crisis into major state intervention into the economy, even some elements of kind of economic planning measures. But they are taking these measures, as the other the other comrades who've spoken have outlined, they've taken those measures ultimately in the interests of protecting private profits. So in Britain, for example, the railways have essentially been nationalised. Companies have been offered up to 80% of workers' wages in state funding in order to try and prevent further mass redundancies. But measures like these, which have been replicated in capitalist countries across Europe, as well as in many other parts of the world, are being taken because they are understood to be necessary to stave off a total economic collapse and the social upheaval that would generate. In other words, these are measures being taken to protect private interests and their ability to make profit. They are not being taken on behalf of workers or in the interests of the majority. And that's why capitalist companies which can maintain profitability during this period, so those which produce ventilators, for example, or those which have the potential ability to produce vaccines or treatments in the pharmaceutical industry. Those kinds of companies are being left in private hands. And that's despite the fact that if your priority and if your goal was saving the maximum number of people from potentially dying of coronavirus, those would be some of the first big companies and monopolies that you would look to nationalise. Doing so is necessary for preventing duplication, for coordinating efforts to ensure research is shared, overcoming some of those problems that were mentioned earlier with patents and so on, making sure that the supply of vital drugs and equipment can be increased and that that can be done as efficiently as possible. So these companies would be first on your list if your priority was ordinary workers' lives and living standards. In actual fact, what this crisis has revealed is the dramatic inability of the capitalist system to adequately respond to human needs, even at its own peril. It was not inevitable that this virus should have been allowed to spread around the world as it has done. Humanity has the technological ability and the scientific knowledge that would have been needed to stop this virus in its tracks. But the chaos of capitalist markets, the sole driving force of which is really the demand for profit, could never have been capable of responding in the way necessary. But who has responded? Because I think the other thing that this crisis has very dramatically exposed is the question of who really keeps our society running, who really creates the wealth, whose work is really essential. There are no billionaires, no bankers, no top executives leaving their homes every morning with their key worker passes in their hands. Those kinds of people are not caring for the sick, looking after the vulnerable, ensuring the supply and distribution of food or of other essentials. Those people are holed up in their mansions, waiting out this storm. And meanwhile, it is working class people who produce society's wealth, who provide its services, and who rescue us in emergencies such as this. And what socialists say is that it should also be workers who are in control of society, therefore. That's why we do stand for nationalisation, but not in order to save capitalism or to protect private interests, in order that the proceeds of production and the vast wealth that is produced can be shared and can be enjoyed by all of humanity, in order that working class people could have democratic control with public ownership of the major banks and monopolies, in order to plan an economy that meets the needs and desires of ordinary people without destroying the planet, in order that rather than the kind of false attempts and faltering attempts at international coordination, which the capitalist class are really incapable of because of the fact that they are competing with each other, you could have the genuine international cooperation of working class people, which is necessary to overcome and to prevent crises such as this. So we say that there should be no return to normality after this crisis. Like the slogan that's being used in Spain and some other countries is, we say so-called normality was the problem. And instead what we need coming out of this is to redouble our efforts and to organise a mass struggle and a fight for a socialist world.
Thank you so much, Claire. You laid out very well what it is that the International Socialist Alternative's goals are and what it is that we're trying to organize people to do. I want to thank everyone for tuning in today. I saw some people wanting to donate in the comments, and we thank you very much. Please go to our website, which is listed below, to make your donation. And those who want to get involved, please join International Socialist Alternative, but also share our website with your friends, with your family, with your neighbors. Let's do what we can to really spread this movement. And don't forget, of course, to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Tune in next week, same time, same place. Bye.